Welcome to week 8. This week we're going to be looking at definitions and ideas of gender across culture. Next week after spring break, we're going to be looking at different cultural understandings of gender, but this week we're going to be looking at our basic definitions of gender and how anthropologists understand gender. So let's get some basic definitions. First of all, we're going to define gender as the socio-cultural construct of masculine and feminine roles and the qualities assigned to these roles. So gender is going to be the focus on the cultural side of what it means to be male or female. So what are the social meanings that we place upon our biological attributes, our particular body parts? Margaret Mead was one of the first anthropologists to study gender as a cultural phenomenon. Before Margaret Mead, who really did her work in the 1920s, people believed that women were biologically prone to be working in the home and that men were biologically predisposed to be working outside the home. And it was believed that this is true for all humans because all humans were the same. However, Margaret Mead suspected that our cultural meanings about gender vary from culture to culture, that this was not purely biological, but this is the meanings that we place on being male and female are more cultural than biological. And to gather evidence about this, she visited a variety of different people across Papua New Guinea, and she studied them. She studied their kind of gender norms in order to understand whether or not they were going to have the same kind of cultural expectations that Westerners have. And she found that they don't. So first she visited the Mundugamor. Basically, she got in a boat in Papua New Guinea and floated down the river and found a variety of different cultures along the way, and she stopped and studied their gender rules or expectations. Amongst the Mundugamor, she found that both women and men were what she considered to be masculine. She said that the women were actually positively sexed, jealous, violent, arrogant, and those would all be kind of characteristics that she would have associated with masculinity. She also noted that the females were prone to having sexual affairs and that they liked violence and scratching and biting. They would even bite out each other's eyelashes. And they would jump out on the pathway and have sex with a man who was walking by. So she said that this was masculine behavior. She thought that the females of the Mundugamor were more masculine behaving. Then she got back in her boat and she went over to see the Chambuli. And what she noticed about the Chambuli is that women were dominant and the men were passive. Females had significant roles, and the Chambuli women were the main suppliers of food. Men, however, were passive and gossipy, and they liked to shop, and they would kind of hang out. So you could kind of see that this in the 1920s was a stereotype of female versus male. Then she got in her boat and she went to the Arapesh. And the Arapesh she found to be all feminine. She thought that both the men and the women were passive, and both men and women cared for children. So she thought that both the men and women were actually more feminine in this society. But what she really determined from this is the idea that these cultures don't understand gender all in the same way, that they each have individual understandings of gender. And that tells us that gender isn't driven by biology, but that gender, or the meanings we attach to being male or female, are much more of a cultural construct. And so even today, anthropologists study gender, the meanings of gender in a cultural context or as a cultural construct. Gender is also a spectrum. What that means is that in a cross-cultural comparison, we can see that gender is, rather than a binary, it's a spectrum. A binary, meaning two, means that there's only male or female. But when we look cross-culturally, what we're going to see in our next lecture is that there's lots of varieties of ways of understanding masculinity and femininity, and many cultures actually have three, four, five different kinds of gender categories, and that there's many more gender categories than just masculine and feminine when we look cross-culturally. Our own culture tends to have a binary understanding of masculine and feminine as if those were the only two possibilities, but that's not true in a cross-cultural understanding. But we'll be getting more into that next week. So let's compare gender with sex. Oftentimes the concept of gender is used interchangeably with sex, but we don't do that in anthropology. In anthropology, sex refers to the biological aspect of being female, male, or other, assigned at birth based on external genitalia. So here we're talking about biology. Gender is culture, sex is biology. So when we're talking about sex, we're talking about chromosomes, right? The XY versus the XX. Interestingly, though, when we look a little bit closer, we think that our XY and our XX are a simple binary also, but when we look closer, we're going to see that there's actually a wide spectrum of different forms of sex expression, meaning that there's lots of different ways in which our bodies can be presented. So what you can see on this kind of spectrum down below is that you can have anything from an XY and XX to a variety of different forms within that. Beyond that, there's also lots of different ways in which people's sex is expressed differently. So you can just see this quick list of different kinds of conditions that cause alternative sex expression, or in other words, the expression of sex characteristics that kind of differ from the traditional male penis or female vagina. We're going to look a little bit closer for a moment to androgen insensitivity syndrome, which in the US is relatively rare in 1 in 13,000 births. However, this is an interesting case when we look closer at this village in the Dominican Republic. This is a picture of Catherine and his cousin Carla. So you can see that boy who's got his arm around the little girl next to him. His name is Catherine. In this particular town, Catherine is known as Gueva Doce, or a penis at 12. That is because he was born with androgen insensitivity. And what happens in androgen insensitivity is that boys, the XY chromosome, when they're in utero, they'll get blasted with androgen, which is going to be the hormone that kind of makes your boy parts turn into boy parts. But some people are insensitive to it. They don't respond to it, even though they have an XY chromosome. So females don't respond to it because they don't have the Y chromosome, but males typically do. But if you have androgen insensitivity, you won't respond to it. And so what that means is that your penis and testicles don't descend, and you have private parts that are either ambiguous or they look feminine. So boys in this town are born at a high rate of looking like girls based on their private parts. They may have an XY chromosome, but they look like females based on their private parts. And so there's this town full of Catherines and Marys, but they are XY children. And why they're called penis at 12 is because they'll be raised as girls, and then when they get to puberty, something else happens. In puberty, you get your own blast of testosterone that comes from your own body and starts to change your body. And when they get the second blast of testosterone, then they actually do respond to it, and their penis and testicles descend at that point. So where they didn't used to have masculine sex characteristics, they develop those sex characteristics. Androgen insensitivity is, again, rare in the United States, but it's super common in this village because in most places around the world, it's kind of an ostracized condition. Boys that are born looking like girls are oftentimes considered to be lesser males, but this isn't so in this village. So because of that, it's extremely common because once they do develop their reproductive organs, they're fully functional and they can reproduce. And so in this village, it occurs at a rate of 1 out of every 100 children is born with androgen insensitivity. So again, we use this as an example of not only how culture and kind of the values about masculinity and femininity can affect our sex characteristics, but also to distinguish the difference between gender and sex, right? So if we're talking about sex, we're talking about biological conditions. If we're talking about gender, we're talking about culture. Same goes for sexuality. So, sexuality is going to be defined as sexual desire for same, opposite, or other gendered and sex categories. So, we're going to talk more specifically about homosexuality and heterosexuality. So, sexual desire for a person of the same gender is going to be considered homosexuality, whereas heterosexuality is the sexual desire for a person of the opposite gender. And again, sexual attraction is a spectrum too, not simply a binary. Um, we're going to talk more about hetero and homosexuality in the next lecture when we look at Nanda's article and where we look at third and fourth genders, because we tend to think of these as simple binaries: homosexuality versus heterosexuality, male versus female, um, masculinity versus femininity. So when it comes to sexuality and sexual attraction, we're going to see it gets really complicated when we look cross culturally. An example of this is found amongst the Sambia of Papua New Guinea. The Sambia engage in a number of different kind of interesting rituals, but basically, one of their core beliefs is that female blood is polluting to men, and so they need to continually be ridding themselves of that contact because, of course, boys are born from females, and because they're born from females, they are born from female blood, and they're constantly trying to cleanse themselves of that contact. So whenever females are menstruating, they have to leave the village um, because if the men come in contact with their blood, then they have a huge problem. They have to go through a cleansing ritual, which is what these guys are doing here. They're taking those reeds and they're putting them down their throat until they vomit out blood, and that vomiting of blood is cleansing. So there's a sense of what's expected of men to kind of stay away from that femininity. But also, here's where we get to kind of where it becomes a gray mixed area for homo and heterosexuality. In amongst the Sambia of Papua New Guinea, again, to become a full man, they have to get away from this feminine liquid or fluid, which in this case is blood. And so they engage in what anthropologists have called ritualized homosexuality. Ritualized homosexuality is where homosexual activity is practiced under certain ritual conditions. And so for the Sambia to fully become men, the young boys must practice fellatio or oral sex on the older men. And the semen of the older men is swallowed or ingested by the younger men. And it's believed that the men's semen will turn those young boys into men. So they want to get rid of the female fluid, which is blood, and they want to ingest the male fluid, which is semen. So as younger boys, they practice fellatio. As older men, they will receive the fellatio or the oral sex. At the same time, they'll be married to women and have reproductive sex with women. So again, whether we would say this is homo or heterosexual behavior becomes a gray area, which is why we call it ritual homosexuality, and we say that sexuality in general is a spectrum. Okay, thirdly, gender is a cultural symbol. So we're going to focus on this a little bit. We've discerned the difference between gender and sex, and we're going to leave sex aside. We'll come back to sexuality a little bit later, but we're going to kind of focus back on gender here because it's a cultural concept. So that is